The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls beginning in 1946 has transformed our understanding of the world that produced both rabbinical Judaism and Christianity. From some of our most ancient manuscripts of what became biblical texts, sectarian documents of an apocalyptic faction adjacent to those very populations that gave rise to the Jesus movement, cryptid and encoded texts hiding esoteric calendrical secrets, textual commentaries, otherwise lost sagas, legal documents, and apocalyptic documents describing the final cataclysmic battle between good and evil. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a fascinating collection of ancient texts. But perhaps among all of those texts, none is more mysterious and inspiring than 3Q15, a Hebrew document punched, chiseled into copper detailing the location of more than 60 hidden treasures, seemingly connected in some way to the Israelite priesthood. Since its discovery on March 20th, 1952, and subsequent publications beginning at the end of the 1950s, the Copper Scroll has fired the imagination of both scholars and treasure seekers alike. Does it detail the lost treasures of the Jerusalem temple, the collective wealth of the mysterious Essenes, the sacred equipment of a briefly existing third temple under the leadership of the messianic claimant Shimon bar Kokhba, or is it just an ancient hoax? A prank, bro, meant to send the Romans on a wild goose chase, or is it something else entirely? The Copper Scroll thus remains one of the great mysteries to emerge from the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Let's explore it. Make sure to subscribe for weekly explorations of topics here in esoteric history, and if you'd like to support this work of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content like this, I hope you consider checking out my Patreon or some of the cool merch that we have over on the channel. But if you're new to the study of esotericism and you want to get the lay of the land, I'd make sure you check out my study guide, which will introduce you to reliable texts in this field. Also, if you're interested in actual historical books on topics in the occult and the mystical, check out Esoterica Rare Books, my esotericism antiquarian bookstore. You can find all those links in the description and in the pinned comment. But now let's turn to 3Q15, the great treasure map of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Copper Scroll. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. In what could have been a fantastic April Fool's joke, the New York Times broke the news of the discovery of the Copper Scroll in 1952. At the back of Cave 3, seemingly distinct from the other scrolls deposited in the cave, two highly oxidized copper scrolls were found in situ by archaeologists. That's important, in situ by archaeologists, the 15th and final documents to be discovered in that cave. The scrolls were found to be incredibly brittle, and unrolling them could have potentially destroyed them. Thus, scholars at first probed the scrolls using mirrors and the inverse of the letters produced by stamping the letters into the copper. And with those non-intrusive methods, they were able to detect lines of text, over 200 letters comprising 50 words and 5 sets of numerals, even complete phrases. And in those early forms of exploration of the scroll, they found something alluring. Phrases like dig or hidden at this distance, the Hebrew word zahav, gold. It wouldn't be until 1955 that scholars would secure permission from the Jordanian government to bring the scrolls all the way over to Manchester to unroll them in the only fashion feasible, by cutting them into sections. And as those painstaking 21 cuts were made, the scrolls, now in 23 distinct sections, were extensively photographed and documented. But sadly, That also started the clock of their rapid deterioration, especially along the edges of the cuts, which sadly bisected letters, words, and even whole columns of text, rendering simply reading the scrolls all the more difficult for a generation to come. Following years of politics and scholar drama and significant varying publications of the texts, the Copper Scroll was subjected to contemporary analysis in France in 1993, with the most recent scholarly edition appearing only in 2015. The study of the Copper Scroll is still in its infancy. The scroll is unique among the Dead Sea Scrolls in virtually every respect. The material of its composition, how it was inscribed, the contents of the text, and the language of the text is composed in. The text itself is composed of nearly 99% copper and 1% tin, thus making it kind of bronze, but mostly copper. It's hammered into 3 sheets about 80 centimeters long and 30 centimeters wide, of about 1 millimeter in thickness. It was originally housed in a clay vessel at the back of Cave 3, but a ceiling collapse at some point shattered their housing, damaging the scrolls in which they were buried. Originally riveted together with a kind of blank protective area as a cover, like a trapper keeper, the text was found in 2 rolls, one larger and one smaller. It's divided into 12 columns of text of about 181 lines, composed of about 3,000 Hebrew letters and 713 words or so, along with 33 sets of numerals, along with 7 sets of 2 to 3 letters of Greek for some reason. It seems that the copper was inscribed by chisel blows onto the copper, thus producing extrusions on the other side of the letters, on the other side of the copper text. Depending on the tools that would have been employed, some letters would have required up to 10 blows, thus revealing a laborious production process for the scroll, probably performed by several scribes, editors, and correctors, though it's most important to point out here that the most recent edition thinks it was just one scribe. Yeah, I'll come back in a minute to the question of how many scribes may have been involved in the production of the scroll. But the script that the text is written in is known as Herodian semi-formal, and it's actually known from other inscriptions around that time, and thus on paleographical lines, that is to say, based on the oldness of the handwriting, we can date the scroll to sometime between 25 and 75 of the Common Era, thus the time of the Great Revolt, and thus the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple. And that's why this text becomes all the more mysterious. What connection might it have, if any, to the Jerusalem Temple and its treasures? The language of the Copper Scroll is a bit unlike most of the other Dead Sea Scrolls, which employ either Aramaic or a more biblical style Hebrew. The Hebrew of the scroll, the Copper Scroll, is much more akin to later rabbinical Mishnaic literature, though pretty distinct all of its own, and further it employs a wide range of words which are otherwise poorly attested in the literature of that time. And when they are found, they're actually found, again, later in rabbinical literature, although it does contain words in Aramaic, seemingly from Greek, and perhaps even a couple of words from Persian. The actual text of the scroll is pretty difficult to parse because the words mostly run together, with the exception of the last section, and there's no much separation, and similar Hebrew letters are actually easily confused. Is it a resh or a dalet? Is it a bet or a kav? A vav, a zayin, a yod, or a nun sofit? Further, the orthography, the spelling of the language, is pretty inconsistent, employing basically the full range of Hebrew spelling conventions, and some consonants are even interchanged with each other. Resh for nun, shin for samech, mem for nin sofit, and a couple of others. Numbers are also written out in a variety of forms, including a form that's actually rarely attested in Hebrew, but does occur in Aramaic and Akkadian, I think, which are called contracted teens. In addition, there are gaps in the text, there are corrections, there are abbreviations, and as I mentioned earlier, there are clusters of Greek letters that I'll discuss in a moment. But given that textual situation alone, any would-be treasure hunter is faced with a profoundly difficult problem. There are just numerous legitimate but widely varying ways to read many of the sentences describing the location of these treasures. Which letters form which words? How are those words meant to be vocalized? Think about English. Bat, bet, bit, bot, and but are all radically different words giving their vocalization. And Hebrew, of course, only supplies the consonants in most cases. Although, again, sometimes you have full spellings and defective spellings in this text. And the textual mess produces one of the myriad questions raised by the scroll. Given that the scroll is written on copper describing the locations of a vast wealth of treasuries, why is it written in such an inconsistent, non-literary Hebrew? Not illiterate by any means, but this is not like Pulitzer-winning Hebrew. One answer may be that the several scribes were actually selected precisely because of their lack of literacy in order to keep the content secret. In fact, it seems that specific sections were left blank only to be filled in perhaps by another scribe, perhaps to add additional layers of security. One scribe only knew so much about any given location or how much was there. Now, it's difficult, if not impossible, to say this at this point, and yet arguments can be made for a single scribe, one apparently growing weary through the laborious creation of the scroll, with the quality of the inscriptions waning and mistakes actually increasing as the laborious chiseling process of this text proceeded. And perhaps they were also rushed toward the end of the scroll's production. Maybe time was running out to secure its secrets. Maybe the Romans were making it a little bit more challenging to get this thing done. So, one scribe, several scribes. Again, the text is not giving up its secrets anytime soon. But given these concerns over language, the text can be generally parsed into a pretty regular pattern of expression. There's a geographical location where a treasure is hidden, a specific direction on the site, the type, weight, and nature of the treasure, and sometimes some additional information. For instance, column 2 of the scroll can be read as follows. In the salt pit, which is under the steps, 42 talents. Eta Nu. In the cave of the old house of tribute, in the third platform, 65 gold ingots. Theta Epsilon. In the underground chamber, which is in the court of the wood chambers, and in its middle, a cistern. In it, vessels and silver. 70 talents. In the cistern, which is opposite the eastern gate at a distance of 15 cubits, there are vessels in the channel which is in it. 10 talents. Delta Iota. In the cistern, which is below the rampart from the east side, in the spur of the rock, 6 bars of silver. Its entrance underneath the large threshold. It goes on and on like that. One of the specific treasures mentioned in the text is also perhaps one of the most mysterious. Occurring in 14 places we find in various grammatical constructions, something like Kali Dema, Betochen or Katochen or Katavan, Etzlam or Etzlan. Again, depending on how you vocalize it. Now, the reading here is contested, but there is a pretty solid example of this treasure in translation in Treasure 22. In the fissure which is in Sokoka, which seems to be somewhere in the neighborhood of Jericho, to the east of Solomon's reservoir, tithe vessels, and with them the tally beside them. Later in the documents, these seem to be holding vessels that contained either aromatic resins, like pine resin, or were used in a very specific cultic function. Thus, these vessels are less valuable from their composition. They're not ever mentioned being made of silver or gold, but they were apparently treasured precisely because of their religious or sacerdotal use. Though, again, the exact Hebrew reading, much less a definite understanding of the nature of these vessels, is pretty unclear, and their exact account remains mysterious. But apparently they were important enough to be retained right alongside gold and silver, and they were obviously important for perhaps religious reasons. The geographic distribution of the treasures seems vaguely bimodal, clustered around Jerusalem and Jericho, though Jerusalem itself as a city is never mentioned by name. A few treasures hidden in the Kidron Valley seem to link these two central clusters. The contents of the treasure seem to be gold, silver, and other metals in varying qualities, varying vessels, especially tithe vessels, as I mentioned, and vestments which seem to be associated with the priesthood, and even other scrolls, including apparently the last deposit, which is seemingly an exact copy, or perhaps an even more detailed copy, of the contents of the copper scroll, perhaps used to locate the treasures more specifically. Calculating the exact scale of the total treasure is profoundly difficult, but given a value of about 20 kilograms per talent, we have at least 1,672 talents of silver and 362 talents of gold. There's around 5 karshes of gold, 507 karshes of silver, 165 gold ingots, 19 gold bars, 4 silver staters, and 20 minas, along with the various pots said to be full of gold and silver of some kind. Even on very conservative measurements, the treasures described are massive in character, about 60 tons of treasure in total. Now, I know that some of you guys out there are real copper scroll aficionados and they're going to object. Didn't earlier estimates for the amount of treasure come out to be somewhere around 200 tons total? Well, yes, and here's where the scholarship has actually made recent gains in the past couple of years. The largest weight used in the scroll is the kikar, or kikarin, or kikarim, the talent, and it's about 20 kilograms or so. But the scroll also features several abbreviations, including one marked simply kaf kaf in Hebrew, which the first generation of scholars translated as an abbreviation for kikarin, or talents. But this is unusual. Why would this scribe only sometimes abbreviate the text, and in some cases even seems to have gone back over the text to expand that kaf kaf to the full spelling of kikarin or kikarim? The answer seems to be that the kaf kaf abbreviation doesn't stand for kikarin, talents, but for another measurement known in similar texts, the Persian unit of the karsh, which was worth about 10 shekel with about 300 karsh to a talent. Thus, the kaf kaf abbreviation is probably kesef karsh, a cash value actually rather than a weight in this case. Thus, texts like those found at the Jewish colony of the Elephantine Island, among others that we know of, can actually help us decode some of the more apparently mysterious elements of the text. And this also explains why we drop from 200 tons of treasures in the days of Milik and Allegro down to 60 or so now. I mean, not to say 60 tons of treasure is nothing, but we're now reading the kaf kaf abbreviation for the silver karsh and not talents. It just drives down the treasure tonnage. Sad Goonie face. But still, 60 tons of treasure. You got 60 tons of treasure? But did any of this really exist at all? I mean, that's a fair question, so much so that the first editor of the text thought it to be a hoax or a fairy tale, if I remember his exact language. To get at that question, we need to start with where the scroll was found. Cave 3 is located about 2 kilometers north of Chebet Qumran, a site often associated with the Essenes, an apocalyptic ascetic Jewish sect known from the literature of that time, especially the texts of the Jewish historian Josephus, Philo of Alexandria, and Pliny the Elder, who give surprisingly accurate information, it seems, about them. Within the caves in the vicinity of Qumran, nearly 1,000 texts and fragments have been recovered, including substantial sectarian literature. These sectarian texts seem to indicate their authors were a community, or yachad, of an apocalyptic dualist group living an ascetic lifestyle of ritual purity and originating in what seems to have been a protest of what they took to be the corruption of the Jerusalem temple. Further, this group seems to have enjoyed communal living, holding their property in common. That's going to matter a lot in just a minute. And they seem to have vanished following the suppression of the Jewish revolts of 66 to 73 of the Common Era, which also, of course, resulted in the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. This is perhaps why all those scrolls remained in those caves in the area around Qumran. Thinking that the end of the world was near, they set to war against the Kittim. This is their theological apocalyptic name for the Romans, and they were annihilated, probably because they brought a bunch of horns and stuff instead of actually planning for a real battle because they thought God would save them. Again, one of the lessons here at Esoterica is if your battle plans, if God will save you, stay home. This is actually all hinted out by Josephus. So along with depositing their vast literature, and given that banking didn't exist at the time, did this sect hide its wealth in various locations and create basically a treasure map in the form of the copper scroll to one day recover it? But this Essene temple priesthood connection seems oddly contradicted by a very salient notion of the hiding places for much of the treasure. It seems to have been generally hidden in ritually unclean places, especially underground crypts, tombs, and waterways, places inaccessible to anyone wishing to maintain ritual purity. So, what explains this? Well, it seems that it was to safeguard the treasure precisely away from other Judeans or other people for whom ritual purity was a concern. Such conditions certainly wouldn't have bothered the Romans, to be sure. They would have looted this treasure no matter where it was. Perhaps such unclean venues would have been the last place Judeans or Roman treasure hunters that knew of Jewish customs would have looked. Maybe they thought the Romans would have thought the Jews would have never hidden it there. Who knows? Whatever the meaning, the juxtaposition of treasures associated with priesthood, deeply concerned with avoiding especially death-related impurity, with storing that treasure precisely in graves and tombs, it's conspicuous to say the very least. Though the persons going in there to get it would have become unclean, but they could have restated their cleanliness using purification, and at least most of the treasure wouldn't have become unclean. This is very strange. On the other hand, even for a sect in its thousands, as reported by Josephus, this is a truly vast sum of treasure. Maybe too vast for a community of even that size, but probably not too vast for the Jerusalem temple. Perhaps it was stored there along with other texts given the breakdown of the social order, or by maybe even a renegade priest or Levite going over to the Qumran sect. It may just be part of the ledger of the temple bank, collections perhaps to build a third temple after the destruction of the second, or even the holdings of a third temple that briefly functioned during the reign of the messianic claimant Bar Kokhba. And as you can see, theories here can just spiral in so many directions. But what seems unlikely to me, and I think most scholars at this point, is that the text is a hoax or a fraud. Exaggerated, maybe, perhaps, but the emerging consensus of scholars is the Copper Scroll does probably, or at least did, point to the locations of authentic hidden treasures. Why? Well, to quote Lefkowitz, it's a dry, cryptic text with virtually no literary value. It's written with laborious care on expensive medium. Copper was not cheap. It was meant to survive indefinitely, and then it was apparently stored in an extremely remote area, hidden so well, frankly, that it wasn't found for 2,000 years. If this scrolling be for trolling, well, it was a long-form bit. Further, the geographic grouping of the deposit sites, including the most mysterious Hochlit, the El Dorado of all Copper Scroll lore, the contents being mostly precious metals and some vessels and vestments and of ritual importance, but nothing truly grand in terms of those ritual elements. There's none of the major or even minor elements of the temple avodah, the temple worship. And also noting Josephus's remark that the temple's treasures were actually not hidden away somewhere. I mean, the Arch of Titus makes it clear that at least the really big stuff the Romans were able to walk out of there with. The ceramic style of the jar in which the Copper Scroll was buried, and the sites of Roman occupation, and even the movement of troops by the Romans in the war, all seem to make it more likely that the treasure was the dispersed holdings of the Essene community rather than the treasure associated with the Jerusalem temple. Now, this also might help unravel the riddle of those mysterious 7 sets of 2 to 3 Greek letters, which appear in the first sheet of the text and always at the end of a line. Of course, Greek letters and entire scrolls written in Greek were present in the Dead Sea Scrolls, so that isn't so strange on its own. I mean, Greek was the international language of that time. And for a while it was thought that those Greek letters were numerical abbreviations, though they represent no known system of numerals or Greek numerals and abbreviation, and they don't seem to indicate any such numerical pattern. Other theories that they were transliterated Hebrew words. One of them, for instance, is Chi Alpha Gamma, which sounds a bit like the Hebrew word Chag, or holiday, though this doesn't really make any sense in this context, and it doesn't really work with any of the other ones. Others suggest that these are various schemes of abbreviations, including perhaps additions or removals of deposits, so a kind of accounting banking scheme, but why would these be written on a copper document, or some other cryptic code or abbreviation? Of course, we know of other cryptic codes in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I've done a whole episode just on those, but those seem to be largely astrological and calendrical in nature. The emerging consensus these days is the Greek letters are abbreviations for the names of either those responsible for making the treasure deposits or for those whom the deposits originally belonged. Thus, Chi Alpha Gamma may have been Kagiras, or Tau Rho could have been Tryphon, or Sigma Kappa could have been Skopos or Skaios, respectively. These are all Greek names of Jews that we know from this time period. Of course, this answer is by no means conclusive, but at least strikes me as a reasonable and simple solution, and typically mysteries, after all, are pretty reasonable and simple when they do get solved. As you can imagine, once the treasure map nature of the Copper Scroll was announced, the rush to recover the treasures was game on. In fact, the slow admission that the scrolls may really detail the locations of real treasures in the region may have been to slow the roll of any basic gold rush in the area. I mean, they were still trying to recover all the Dead Sea Scrolls at the time. So, what treasures have been recovered using the Copper Skull as a guide since it was discovered? Well, none. I mean, who knows what's on the black market these days, frankly, but nothing publicly. Richard Freund has suggested that the Cave of Letters in Nachal Hever may be the location of the treasure noted in the Cave of the Pillar with the two openings facing east. At the northern opening, buried 3 cubits, there is an urn containing a book, and under that there's 642 silver karsh. And while some truly incredible elements, some items have been found in that cave, including incense pans and letters to and from Bar Kokhba himself, and the archive of a local wealthy woman were found, the cave doesn't seem to be correctly oriented, nor have the specific treasures mentioned in the Copper Scroll ever been found there. But if the treasure were real, what happened to it? I'd imagine that some of it was probably recovered by those who survived the war with the Romans. I imagine some more of it was probably taken by the Romans themselves once they captured anyone with information about such hidden deposits. I mean, this was part and parcel of post-bellum Roman interrogations of prisoners, so I imagine the Romans just beat the locations out of some people. Some of it was probably found by accident in the past couple thousand years. We know that scrolls and other objects were found in the region of Jericho. Origen seems to have used one of those scrolls, perhaps, in the construction of his version of the Bible, known as a hexapla. Still later, Timotheus, the patriarch of Seleucia, also reports that scrolls being found in similar caves in and around Jericho in the 9th century. About a century later, a Karaite presented another scroll in Jerusalem. So I imagine many of them were just dug up on accident. Treasure hunting, also known as looting, have been going on in that region as long as there has been treasure in that region. But I'd be very surprised if it's all been found. I can easily imagine a heap of gold and silver, linen and vessels, maybe even another scroll, have been long sitting in the dark of some long forgotten cistern, tunnel, or tomb. Or perhaps that's just the Dungeons and Dragons talking. My only hope is that these treasures hold out for scientific archaeological excavation so that we can all cherish their discovery. The standard text of 3Q15, the Copper Scroll, is now Emile Puch's edition. It contains a very helpful introduction, a diplomatic edition of the Hebrew text, extensive commentary, and a state-of-the-art facsimile drawing of the text based on the most modern scientific analysis done so far. At this point, it's the definitive edition. However, if you want to really experience just how difficult it is to produce such a diplomatic edition, I would really encourage you to take a look at the Lefkowitz edition, which probes each and every single word down to the letter, just to see how challenging it is to produce a reliable reading of the scroll. He looks at every single possible vocalization at some point. It's just... Of course, both of these are... they're published by our good friends at Brill, whose corporate treasure makes the Copper Scroll look like a child's piggy bank. Thanks, Brill, for hoarding all the money. Of course, ever the Goonie, more on the intersection of esotericism and treasure to come. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, religion, and treasure.